welcome to Bird News and Views. I'm your host, Don Burgess, and tonight we are having a little bit of post-budget analysis by three of our regular experts on these sort of financial matters. And we want to first welcome Cordell Riley, who's an institutional researcher at the Bermuda College and former government research statistician. Welcome, sir.
Good evening. Thank you for having me.
Always a pleasure. Cheryl Packwood, former CEO of Business Bermuda and former overseas representative and director of the Washington, D.C. office for Bermuda. Welcome, Cheryl.
Hi, Don. How are you? Thank
Great,
you for having me.
And last, but certainly not least, is Craig Simmons, lecturer in economics at Bermuda College. And I looked at your LinkedIn page, and I didn't realize you'd been there for 32 years already. So, and you only look 32, so I don't know how that happened.
Thank you, Don.
Okay. So let's dive right in. Let's get your overview impression of the 22-23 budget, and we'll start with Cordell.
Well, for me, it was quite a surprise. I was gearing up for at least the normal 5% increase in taxes, given the expenditure required to sustain the relief for the pandemic. So I was at least expecting that increases. So when that wasn't there, I was rather surprised, and generally surprised overall that there weren't very much increases in the taxes. And of course, the one that everybody refers to is the 10% decrease in licensing fees. A little bit of surprise that that's across the board. There's no means test, but there you have it. But I think for me, the overall thing that stood out was greater regulations for the banks. The banks are largely unregulated from a consumer point of view. So this curb on taxes, the curb on the fees of the banks, powers to stay in execution in terms of a home. All of that was welcome, and I think the premier could have even gone further, having something like a financial ombudsman that could be a mediator between the banks and the clients. So I think that's was welcome news, but as I said, I think that could have gone further.
Okay, thank you. Cheryl, your opinion?
I have to admit, I was disappointed with the budget. I felt that in many ways, it was a budget without a future. It's an austerity budget, but there's no, as everybody has mentioned, there was no means really for raising revenue. There was just, we'll get more tourism and that will bring in more revenues. That's not enough. What are we going to do next year? We just keep kicking the can to the next year. Instead of increasing taxes, as Cordell pointed out, there are decreases on fees and licensing fees, and the decrease for those making under 96,000, which is a good thing. But there was no attempt really to increase either the maximum, which is amount that can be taxed of your salary, as Craig Simmons said when he was on the Daily Hour, we have to start trying to get at other income, at those that make more money. And I'm sorry, Craig, but it's not your salary that they really need to be taxing. They need to be getting at those making $1 million, $2 million. And until they start also taxing corporations, and it could be as simple as a 1% corporate income tax that would bring in the necessary money to give us a sustainable budget, bring down the debt to a sustainable debt to government revenue ratio. All of this made me feel like, well, there's no future, there's no plan. How are we ever going to get out of this? There was like one sentence, oh, we will diversify the economy. But how really? How, I mean, instead of just every year we get this blanket statement, we're going to diversify the economy. We don't have a plan to get there. We don't have a future to see. There's no sense that that Bermuda, there's an intention to make Bermuda a sustainable place with a sustainable budget.
Okay. Now, I saw what you were talking about with the payroll tax and how for the upper income, it's since 2017, it's only gone from 8.75% to 9.5%. And whereas the middle class, even though the lower band has been reduced, the actual tax rate in the middle band has gone up. So what sort of percentage do you think that those making $1 million or more should have to pay?
It doesn't even have to be that much in order to start bringing in more revenue. The government has to find a means of bringing in more revenue, and that's going to be increasing payroll taxes, creating a corporate income tax, which would be in keeping with what the OECD is requiring of the world. Also, the other thing that I noticed is that they wanted the cutting of taxes on oil imports in order to make gas and oil more affordable. Well, if you looked at the gas price, the oil price per barrel as of the close of yesterday, it was over $116. When this budget was set, it was $40 to $60. Now, I actually do fault the government for not seeing down the line to where we are. This Ukraine-Russia crisis is not as of 2 weeks ago. It's been around since October of 2021, and it's been getting worse and worse and worse. And Russia provides something like 10% of the world's oil. It provides 40% of it to Europe. The US is already producing the maximum amount of oil that it is supposed to be producing. Yes, we're trying to look at where we can open up oil reserves. Nevertheless, we've had, I would say, more than double the price of oil per barrel. There is no way that even reducing taxes on oil imports to zero will people be able to pay their electricity bill going forward. Normal people. So without subsidy, in many ways, the government is going to have to subsidize electricity. But how can they do that if they don't even have the revenues to support what they're already trying to do now?
I do want to get into the threat the whole Ukraine-Russia crisis poses to our economy, but I want to get Craig into the discussion here. Craig, what was your overall impression of the budget?
Holding the slack tight. I'm not exactly sure what that means, but my understanding of it is that you're in a precarious situation and you really don't have the courage to move forward and address it, sort of square in the face. And so for me, the sort of the elephant in the room is our $3.3 billion in debt, and that this has to be sort of decreased. For me, we live in an uncertain world, and if I've learned anything since the financial crisis, it's that expect the unexpected. And living in a globalized, hyper-globalized environment, something in the Ukraine will have a profound impact on life in Bermuda. So this sort of super connectivity in the global economy means that there's stuff always happening, and it will always affect us. And so trying to build resilience into the economy, one of the best ways we can do that is to reduce our exposure to the global economy. And the one for me, at least when budget comes around, is reducing our debt. And the earliest possible date for that seems to be around 2026, when the present premier is likely to be not in office. So in some ways, he sort of kicked the can down the road for his successor. And so, the glide slope that the finance minister has set is, in my estimation, a little too shallow. I'm really afraid that he'll run out of runway.
When you say finance minister, you mean the premier?
Finance minister and
Okay.
yes, they're one and the same nowadays.
Yeah.
And so that for me is the greatest fear: running out of runway in trying to begin the process of paying down the debt, because the next sort of catastrophe is right around the corner, and deferring this repayment is only going to lead to more pain.
Okay. What do you think the strength is of this budget, Craig?
Well, the strength, I suppose, I misspoke on Friday when I was asked about the budget. I had spent about 45 minutes on it, and I should have said that the budget isn't bad. I misspoke and said that it was good. So you're now asking me, and as I had more time to reflect, it definitely makes sense to say that it's not a bad budget. And you want me to pick out what's good about it. Well, you can license your car a bit cheaper. In terms of addressing the divide between the haves and the have-nots in Bermuda, offering a tax break on payroll tax for those folks under 96,000, although I believe in the PLP's platform, there was supposed to be a total break, I think, for folks at the bottom. But I think he didn't have enough slack in his tight to deliver on that promise. So he delivered half of that promise. So that was arguably a positive,
Right. I
helping
think
those two sides.
in this budget is down to 2% for those under 48,000.
48,000.
Okay. And I think he is in his original election promise, it was to take it to zero. And he did apologize for that. So that is a positive, because as I said on Monday, Cheryl, there are these two Bermudas, those folks who can work remotely, and those folks who can't, and those folks who can work remotely, their bank balances are arguably bigger this year than they were last year or before the pandemic. And whenever I go to the BMA and look at the volume of savings that we Bermuda residents have stashed away, we've reached a new milestone. We've cleared $4 billion in savings. And I would attribute that squarely to the fact that people like me working from home are really able to save more. And then on the flip side, you've got folks in the hospitality and retail sector who are on financial assistance. And that just doesn't seem fair.
Now, well, part of the thing, I think, like in the past, you criticized the fact that Bermudians hadn't been saving enough. So this is a much welcome addition.
Well, in fact, the problem isn't that Bermudians aren't saving enough. In fact, the savings rate in Bermuda is just shy of 40%. The problem is that those savings pretty much all leave Bermuda. So you have an imbalance between what Bermudians are saving, which is just shy of $3 billion, and that which goes into this thing called investment spending, into capital spending, which is about half as much. And so you have this severe imbalance. That's the problem that I see.
Okay. Cordell, what do you think are the strengths of this budget?
Well, as I alluded to earlier, there are no shocks for the ordinary person. So if they were concerned about having to pay more taxes at a time than many of us can't afford it, then they have breathed a collective sigh of relief. So I think that in itself is a good thing. And I think overall, obviously from a consumer point of view, not having to pay more taxes is a good thing. but as my fellow panelists have alluded to, the fact that you've got to get that revenue from somewhere. Now, I looked at the budget brief that Deloitte and Touche puts out every year, and one of the things I really noticed, which I wasn't expecting, was the revenues versus expenditures. The widest point of the gap was in 2013 of about $300 million. And that was steadily getting closer. Of course, with America's Cup, there was an increase in revenues. And by 2020, those revenues versus expenditure, the gap was only about less than 100 million. And of course, with the pandemic, it started to open up again to more than 100 million. And Craig was saying that by 2026, well, they're indicating that by 24, 25, we may have reached the balanced budget. But of course, the elephant in the room is the current European tribal wars, which could impact greatly any expectations of revenue. So from a consumer point of view, no real increases in taxes, as Craig mentioned, holding the slack. But then the concern is what's happening down the road.
Right. Cheryl, what's your opinion on the strengths of this budget?
You know, there was a nod to this digital bank, and I'm not quite sure what they're thinking of. I know that Wyoming gave its first banking license for a digital bank to take deposits and of digital assets and so forth. And I don't know if that's what they're thinking of, something like that. There's also, I don't know if they've got if stablecoin is in their purview. You know, fintech has only given us 60 jobs in the past, what, 4 years, 5 years? We are not the global fintech center of the world, as the budget said. But Don, it's hard for me to find what was positive in this budget. I have to be quite honest. The budget really, when you read between the lines, because I read it with Premier Burt's voice in my head, and it came across very positive when I read it with his voice in my head. And I know he has to do that because as the premier, he also has to give comfort and hope to the population. Without hope, how can we continue? How do we go out the next day to do our jobs, to send our kids to school without hope? But when you see a budget that has no real design to increase revenues, to even bring in revenues to meet our debt, yes, we've reduced the deficit, but I'm still very worried. We did this panel, I think it was in 2019. Was that the last time I saw you guys? But I saw you online in 2020, but in person was in 2019. And I remember I was very concerned about the budget then, and they were digging into the sinking fund to meet debt payments and bring down the deficit. And we're not even in as good shape as we were in 2019. The comparisons are being made to 2020 instead of pre-pandemic or 2017 even. So I'm even more concerned than I was in 2019.
Yep. So would you consider that a weakness of this budget then?
What is that?
Well, that they haven't addressed these issues.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And the debt isn't 3.3 million, it's really 3.4 million because it's 3.5 plus the 50 million guarantee that's not in the budget for the Southampton Princess. And again, how are we going to meet these payments? How are we going, and even just servicing the debt, how are we going to give the necessary services to our people, be it extended COVID relief if COVID doesn't go away, relief on our electricity consumption and our oil consumption, our gas consumption to get to work. If oil is over $100 a barrel, how are we going to, the government is going to have to subsidize something going on there with the electricity company, with our gas for our cars. This is a great time to actually have a true plan for sustainable energy, for whether it's floating panels, solar panels on the water, or windmills. You can even put those on the water. This would be a brilliant time to start thinking about that, because that also brings in new jobs. We have to expand our population. I've said this before, but and if you read the budget, Premier Burt is going around in circles and saying, yes, we have to expand our population. It's really about, we're going to have to bring in people, because to bring, and whether they are Bermudians who are happily living abroad or who want to come back or who want to come for the first time, we need to expand the tax base. That's the payroll tax base. And we can only do that if we increase jobs. So I keep going back to, we need to figure out a true sustainable plan for building revenue, for diversifying our economy, for creating sustainable energy, so that if you're currently paying $300 a month for your electricity bill, it's going to be $600 or $700 next month without taxes.
Craig, what do you think about that? And what do you think are some of the weaknesses in this budget?
Well, Cheryl's alluding to the sort of situation in Ukraine and how it will affect energy prices. What I'm hoping is that these high energy prices will accelerate the transition from the use of fossil fuels towards, say, the electrification of transportation, the installation of photovoltaic, largely because placing a bet on renewable energy will in all likelihood give us the buffer that we need against the chaos that I think is normal in a global economy. So in some ways, I sort of like the fact that energy prices are starting to go up, because it's going to make solar energy, electrification of transportation, more attractive, given that I think the duty on electric cars is still zero. We could see an acceleration in that process because of what's going. But of course, it's going to be a slow and arduous process, and probably it's not going to benefit folks at the bottom of the socioeconomic ladder, because they'll be still stuck in their gas guzzling cars.
Well, I know, like, the U.S. is moving toward, the car manufacturers are moving towards electrifying their fleets and stop producing gas guzzlers. I mean, the Super Bowl itself, all the car ads were for electric vehicles.
Well, I think it's because the world, made a lot of promises in Glasgow last year to reduce their carbon footprints. And so electrification of transportation is one such way to reduce that footprint.
And Cordell, what do you think are some of the weaknesses in this budget?
Well, I think I've mentioned already as Craig mentioned about the two Bermudas. Here we have these the inability or the unwillingness to tax those who are able to pay more. Now, Cheryl mentioned about the international company, et cetera, et cetera. I think Craig could back me up on this, that there is an agreement in place that there's no new taxes for them until 2035. And so that's the reason that you can't just go to them and just tax them because that's already scribed in stone. But there are ways you can say, for instance, I mentioned if government were to have a financial ombudsman, for instance, to provide a buffer between the customers of the banks and the financial institutions, then that could be raised through a corporate financial tax. And that way, that office will pay for itself. So it's not a corporate tax on those who are not doing business, those who are doing business outside of Bermuda. It's a tax on those who are getting their revenue from the customers here. And as you know, places like the insurance companies, financial institutions, they pretty much had a free ride. They've seen some downturn, but not very, very much. As I mentioned to you about earlier, offline, about when I went to register my car back in 2008 on that recession, and they weren't giving any recessionary discounts, then the only way you got a discount is to not to register your car. But I think we haven't really tackled inequality in this budget. Like I said, there was no means test for those the 10% discount. So those who, as Cheryl mentioned, that those who are earning the $1 and $2 million a year, they're going to get that 10% discount just like the rest of us. So I think we really have to look at the overall tax base, and we might have to really look at whether or not that 2035-year law should remain, or whether we should be able to change that in order for even to get a 1% increase. I remember the head of Endurance said that he would be in favor of a 10% tax on international companies, starting off at 1% and gradually going up. But I didn't see him getting any support from his colleagues. So the silence was certainly deafening. But I think we do have to tackle inequality, and I don't think the budget really tackled that at all.
Well, there is a ray of hope coming from the finance minister of the United States, Janet Yellen, with her, minimum corporate tax. And so that would be one way of getting around that particular problem, that legislative barrier that exists. Because, if this gains traction in the next year or two, whatever legislation we have in Bermuda would become null and void. So that could be a potential windfall. Of course, that's all subject to negotiation, but Bermuda stands, in fact, to gain from this minimum tax, that's this global minimum tax. And so it could be a way for us to significantly address the problem of our debt.
And it would address the problem of our debt, and it would also provide a cushion for us to deal with the blows that are coming from the global arena. And when I'm saying 1%, even if you took off initially the $2 billion that's coming from international business, you still have $4 billion or $3 billion or so coming from the local economy. And then you a 1% tax on that, even if a company is making $100,000 or $50,000 a year, they would be paying what, $500. Is my math right?
Not sure. But
I'm sorry.
I get
you understand what I'm saying?
Yeah.
We would still be able, with a 1% on local companies, we would be able to raise a certain amount of revenues that would reduce the budget to the debt to government revenue ratio, and make it more sustainable. And then with what's going to take place in terms of the OECD and the minimum tax revenue, we would be, we would be able to raise additional and enough revenue to do what we need to do, probably.
Now, the only problem that I foresee, I'm thinking about, is it Odysseus when he's on his way home and he's almost home and he hears those sirens singing out to him, and he gets his sailors to sort of stick wax in their ears and tie himself to the post just so that he won't be drawn to the sweet voice of those sirens. In the case of a politician, the sweet voice is going to be some economic recovery plan version 2, version 3, because politicians will always find somewhere to spend additional tax revenue. So
Yeah.
I would love it if the politicians would tie themselves to the mast and say any funds coming from this minimum corporate tax would go straight toward paying down the debt. But I know that
But Craig, it can't just all in one swoop go to paying down the debt. We do have to provide services to our people.
Yeah.
And
but this is additional, in addition to everything.
Right.
Paying off the debt is a generational task. It's not going to happen overnight. But you need to develop the fiscal discipline. And that is something that we talked about back in 2019 when they did some financial shenanigans. Instead of earnestly paying off the debt, they were just so busy, trying to balance this thing called the budget. I want to see the government develop the discipline. And once they get in the habit of doing this thing, it'll be easier. The hardest part is starting it.
I also just wanted to add that we're not just speaking out of nowhere that we need to raise revenues. It's the fiscal responsibility panel report just came out for the 7th time, or is it the 8th time in the past 7 or 8 years. And it's interesting because the budget keeps referring to the austerity part of the plan, and it didn't say anything about the revenue, that we have to build revenues, and that was very much in the financial responsibility, the fiscal responsibility panel report.
Yes.
And I think it would have been nice if they had referred to that as well and told us how they were going to raise revenues.
Well, again, that can was kicked down the road. And I think the previous finance minister, gave the rationale for not embodying the Tax Reform Commission version 2, because he wanted to see how Janet Yellen's minimum tax was going to play out. And so that's the reason given. And so the government is likely not to have a plan for broadening the tax base until until the Tax Reform Commission version 2 concludes its deliberations. But maybe
I agree with you. I agree with you, Craig, but at the same time, they know that there's going to be a required tax. If you start with something as minimal as 0.5% or 1%, at least we're in gear, and we're building some revenue, much needed revenue in the immediate current present. And that's what we need to do.
Yeah, if I can interject, according to the projected revenues from next year on 5 years, government is looking to increase revenue by 22% over those 5 years, from 1.02 billion to 1.248 billion. So how's that going to happen?
Well, that's coming from this thing called economic growth. So it's predicated on economic growth, not on broadening the tax base. So the idea is that if the economy grows by 4% nominally, tax revenues will grow by 4%.
So do you think that's reasonable given the current world situation with Russia and the economy, the oil prices?
Well, I think
with COVID.
Again, that's predicated on tourism, and given that tourism makes up about 5% of our economy, and that in the last couple of years, it hasn't been able to make a contribution. If we could get tourism back to that sort of 2019 level, it's conceivable that at least in 1 year you can get the 4% bump. But of course, in subsequent years, that's not going to happen. So that would be a one-off.
Okay.
In the
But
best
I mean,
case scenario.
there's a certain drag already built in tourism with the old chicken and the egg with air flights and hotel rooms, and with the Fairmont Southampton closed and the Elbow Beach closed. You've taken out a lot of inventory that doesn't make Bermuda an attractive place for airlines to fly, thus increasing the tourism.
It is an optimistic projection, yes. But as Cheryl said, the premier has to exude optimism and hope for our people.
Cordell, did you want to jump in and say something?
Yeah, I was going to say the foundation for all of this. There's two sides. You have the raising tax revenue, and the other part is growing the economy. Cheryl alluded to having to bringing more people, but I think if you're able to grow the economy, that becomes a natural progression because we don't have sufficient people here to fill the jobs that would be created. So the economy has to grow. The difficulty is how to do that. Tourism is going to come back in some way this year because we're almost at ground zero. So with the easing up of the travel friction, if you will, you're likely to see more persons coming in. I was at the Grotto Bay this past weekend. They told me they had 60% occupancy, but I would imagine a fair amount of that was local traffic, but there is quite a few tourists that are there. So I think that's an indication that the season is coming back. But when and Greg mentioned about the 5% contribution to the economy, that was pre-pandemic of tourism. With the thousands of employees right now, so it's still a very tiny amount in terms of GDP. So we have to really have an overall plan going forward. Do we want tourism to increase to 7.5%? Do we want tourism to increase to 10%? And what does that look like? Obviously, you're going to have need more beds. Airlines don't come to destinations that are shrinking. And this is why we see the number of airline flights being cut. And so people say, well, why are we building hotels? Because we're not filling them right now. But airlines like to see growth. But I think in terms of where do we want to end up, that becomes a part of a national tourism plan, a national economic plan in terms of what contribution do we want tourism to play, because then the players will be able to know what their contribution is, what role they have to play. So I think having that sort of a national plan and maybe a 5 or 10 year national plan will certainly help us to get on the way. But I don't think we have anything of that nature. I know the PLP's election platform mentioned about a 10-year plan, but governments, once they get elected, tend to think short term because they've got to go back to the voters every now and then to get a mandate. But something along those lines, and certainly knowing what we want the economy to produce in terms of the various sectors would help us to start planning and see how we can grow that economy.
We haven't talked about tonight the social insurance pension fund too much. It hasn't been addressed this budget. Should it have been looked at this budget? Again, we've heard the phrase a couple of times, kick the can down the road. So it's not going to be at least until next year that it's examined and maybe something done to adjust it.
Well, I mean, Dawn, that goes back to the SAGE Commission. I mean, that was 2017 or thereabouts. At that point in time, it was clear that the contributory pension fund would be broke around 2042, and the same with the public workers pension fund. All of the pension funds are unsustainable. That's been known for quite some time. The problem is doing something about it. And perhaps the single best sort of way to address it would be to change it from a defined benefit scheme to a defined contribution scheme. But that is politically contentious. It was politically contentious for the then Bank of Bermuda before it became HSBC. I think that was sort of Henry Smith's last battle when he was CEO of the bank, forcing, in fact, the employees of the then Bank of Bermuda to accept a defined contribution scheme, because defined benefit schemes just aren't sustainable. And then there's the issue of the pensionable age still being 65 or trying to move it to 68. People are living a lot longer. And with the social insurance, the contributions are fixed, they're not tied to income. So there are a number of unpopular policy options that governments don't seem to have to quote a previous finance minister, the testicular fortitude to implement. And so we kick the can down the road.
Cordell, what are your thoughts on the retirement age and the pension fund?
Well, I think with regards to the pension fund, there was a challenge previously when we wanted to change that, or was mooted about having it floated, about having it change, and there was resistance, because once you have your pension guaranteed, it's nice to know, but when it's based on other factors, and which means that the overall payout could be less, then you will have fierce resistance from the unions. But to take a leaf out of the Premier's book, some tough decisions are going to have to be made. With regards to the aging population, well, we've talked about that long before. I think I wrote a piece for the National Office of Seniors back in 2015, I think it was, when the projections were that the elderly population was going to overtake the youth population in 2030, and that we had time to write a plan and execute that plan. But when the next projections came out from the Department of Statistics, it was actually in 2017. And so the likelihood is that we've already crossed that milestone, and the fallout is before. So we have a number of things that we have to challenge: an aging population, a pandemic that's still with us, and Europe and their wars. So those things are likely to impact us, and that's why even though the revenue situation was looking better up until 2020. Since then, of course, it's gone down, and the war now puts that very much into play, whether or not those revenues will be able to be achieved. So we do have quite a bit of challenges facing us.
Now, I don't know if it was you that when we talked earlier this year was saying, like, at one point we had a 6-to-1 ratio of people paying into the fund to people taking out. Now it's down to 2-to-1. 2 people
That
paying.
may have been Craig.
Might have been Craig. Okay.
Yeah.
But the sheer numbers, it's so almost like a pyramid scheme. You got to keep getting new people in at the bottom to prop up the top.
Well, yeah, a pension fund, almost by definition, or a defined benefit pension fund, it in fact is a pyramid scheme. You do need to have more and more people coming in at the bottom to pay for those who are drawing from it. And of course, because the demographic pyramid is now upside down, it is in fact unsustainable. And so you need to change the rules of the game.
Yeah. We talked around it quite a bit tonight about Russia and the war with Ukraine. What are, besides oil prices, what are some of the other threats that Bermuda could face from that? We've heard people talk about the civil air aviation list, and Bermuda has over 700 aircraft registered to Russian-based entities. So what?
Yeah, there's 900 registered aircraft, of which 740 are Russian owned, and also some of the law firms, the Bermuda law firms, have offices in Moscow. So yes, and then the SWIFT payment system that's been cut off from with Russia, all of that is going to take its toll on Bermuda. We are a financial services jurisdiction, and to the extent that financial services is our business, it's going to hit us. Also, there's the upcoming issue with the China and Taiwan, and then if the U.S. There's another sanction that the U.S. Could impose, which would mean that any technology or product derived from a U.S. business cannot be sold to Russia or cannot be dealt with regard to a Russian person. This was used. This was used to cripple China with regard to Huawei, and then almost put Huawei into the Chinese telecom giant, and almost put Huawei into bankruptcy. That could hurt both trade with Russia as well as China and Taiwan if that issue comes to a peak. If China actually does go in and take Taiwan. Because Taiwan, as my understanding is, Taiwan produces something like 90% of the chips that are used in the world. And that would cripple everybody.
Greg, your thoughts on the war and how it might affect Bermuda?
Well, the obvious one is how the price of oil will increase, and increases in the price of oil will affect everything from the plastics that we use on a daily basis. They will affect transportation, so shipping costs, the fact that Bermuda is so isolated. Getting to Bermuda will be more expensive. Airfares will be up. Shipping costs will be up. Oil is everywhere in our economy, and so the ripple effect will be profound. Is profound. I mean, as Cheryl mentioned, it's crossed $100. We've had sort of a great party for the last couple of years as oil has been, $40 and $50. Having said that, we're still below the peak that oil hit in 2007. So, and this speaks to another topic about this thing called normal. Like, where do we want to get back to? Prior to the financial crisis, the world had basically lost its mind. Oil prices, again, had crossed something like $140. Right now, we're talking about $100. Food prices were skyrocketing because the Chinese economy was growing, and Chinese people were transitioning from a vegetable-based diet to a meat diet, and the cows have to eat so much more soybean and corn, and that was driving up the price of grain, which in turn drove the price of food. So we've sort of seen these price spikes before, and of course, thank goodness there was a financial crisis, which essentially broke the back of those escalating prices of 2007. And so if you want to get a sense of what's coming, I suppose we could go back to 2005, 2006, 2007. I don't know if your memories take you back that far, but I know that life in Bermuda was rather tense to the extent that traffic jams were unbearable. It was, the economy was booming, housing was booming. It was basically turning young people off. And so I was in a forum today where people are actually dreaming of us getting back to a workforce of over 40,000. I think that would be a mistake. If we're thinking in terms of a new normal, I think that new normal has to be less than 40,000. As low as 35,000, I don't think so, but somewhere between 35 and 40,000 for workforce would be something that I think our economy could tolerate, because we've got to consider the sustainability, the environmental sustainability in terms of our workforce. If there are too many people chasing too few homes, that's going to create a property bubble. And so,
But then, Craig, we can build up. There's a lot more working from home. If we have electric cars, if we're using non-fossil fuels for energy, we could manage much of this if we improve waste treatment. We need to increase the population and the workforce in order to sustain whatever our life.
and I agree with you totally. But unfortunately, as we've seen coming out of the pandemic, as demand races forward, there are these things called supply bottlenecks. So in order to provide the housing for our people will take time. The problem is that the demand for labor, you could have insurance companies growing, you can have the hospitality industry growing, and the granting of work permits doesn't take long, but it takes a lot longer for us to build apartments, to change planning laws, to implement the electrification of transportation. So you need, as Cordell suggested, some kind of plan that will try and circumvent supply bottlenecks, because otherwise.
Absolutely. I mean, I think when we're talking about, do we go to a population of 70,000 or 75? We're not talking about it happening between now and 2023. It has to be planned, and it would be over a process of maybe 10, 15 years. But we can go back up to 66,000 where we were, or 65 within the next 2 to 5 years.
Yeah.
I'm just scared to say in a public forum, oh, we can't do more than 35,000, because then we won't plan to grow, and we need to plan. We need to make that plan. We need to put it in our heads that we need to go beyond where we were.
Well, if I can just add here, back in, I think it was 2000, when I was at the Department of Statistics, and I had responsibility for the employment survey. I did the very first forecast, and I forecasted that by 2010, if the economy kept growing the way it was, we would have 40,000 jobs in 2010. I was wrong, as usual. That actually happened in 2008. So it was growing. The economy was growing a lot faster than I had even predicted, and obviously with the downturn in the economy, with the market crash and all of that, we started to see the fallout. But what, Craig, you have just done is added a dose of reality here in terms of the actual numbers. So we need 10 to 12,000 people. And we have about 34,000 employed right now. If you bring in 10,000 people or workers, you're talking about more than that in terms of families, et cetera, and that's going to take us to a population that we probably haven't had in a while. But then it takes us back to the things that we were experiencing before that we didn't like. So it has to be planned going forward. Otherwise, we end up doing the same things that we've done before. So we all agree that there's some growth in our economy that has to happen. But I often get irritated when people just throw out, well, we need 10 to 12,000 jobs, or we need to change immigration policies. I don't know of any business who has difficulty bringing in the people that they need. I don't think that is, in fact, the barrier. The challenge is growing the economy. And I think that's the foundation. And once we start to do that, that we also employ Bermudians, and businesses get to bring in those, fill those jobs for those Bermudians, for those who Bermudians cannot fill. But I think really this is the time when we should have a national plan that runs from 10 to 20 years.
We're running out of time. We've got about 4 minutes left. So I just want to say yes or no. Do you think this is a threat for this coming year? Not down the road, but for this coming year. COVID, financial threat to Bermuda. Cheryl?
Yes.
Craig?
Yes.
Cordell?
Yes, but waning.
The U.S. economy. Cordell?
Yes, I think I'm not supposed to, but I'll just say this because I meant to say this before. In terms of the overall threat of what's happening in Europe, is creating this uncertainty, and uncertainty for business doesn't go together, and so that could also be a challenge facing us. And so the U.S. economy, yes, it will be have an impact on us.
Craig, I hope your one word isn't as long.
Sorry.
Growth in the U.S. economy will have a positive effect on our economy.
Okay,
It will
Cheryl?
grow.
Will it have an effect on our economy?
Threat, possible threat.
Yes.
All right. The OECD gray list / black list / white list for this next year. Cheryl?
Yes.
Craig?
No.
Cordell?
It will be short-lived. I think we'll move off of it.
Is that a yes?
It's a partial yes.
All right. Quickly, one-word description or one-sentence description. I won't limit you to one-sentence description on the employee tax rate for people under 96,000 being reduced since 2017. Cordell?
What is the question?
It's a one-word sentence on your feelings toward the government reducing the employee tax rate for people earning $96,000 since 2000.
It's a good move, but we also have to take into consideration that those who are earning more than that could be families with one income, and so just don't focus on a number. I think we have to look at the total picture.
Okay, Craig?
It begins to address the serious problem of inequality in Bermuda.
Cheryl?
It's a good thing, but it's not enough.
We agree, Cheryl.
No, I'm usually the radical in the group.
All right, so I want to give you all a chance for a last word here on anything that we didn't discuss that you feel is like important, and we'll start with Craig, so you have less time to think about it.
Well, I'll end where I started, and that is with expect the unexpected. And this speaks against the idea of having economic plans, or at least when you create a plan, you need to build resilience into it, which is why I think the move toward renewable energy, the electrification of transportation, basing our electricity on solar is a necessary move, because it will give us a bit of a shock absorber from the uncertainties in the global economy.
Okay, thank you. Cheryl?
I'll start again where I started an hour ago. This budget is a budget without a future, and we need a future. We need to create a sustainable Bermuda. And that goes to diversification, vertical farming. We need to feed our people. We need to feed our children. We need to ensure that Bermuda is here in 20 years for the next generation. And that means putting together that 20-year plan, as both Cordell and Craig have talked about, and me. And that's vertical farming. Is there some fintech in there? But fintech the understanding that cryptocurrency brings in money laundering and all those bad sort of things, but it can be managed. There's a whole working group on fintech and cryptocurrency. There's a great conference that took place this past November that I was lucky to attend. And they're doing amazing things, and they are thinking about regulation and how do you protect the consumer, and it doesn't have to be the boogeyman that we all fear. But that goes to, again, let's create a sustainable Bermuda. Let's create that plan so that we see renewable energy. We see electric cars only on the roads. We're small enough that we can have only electric cars, that we see solar farms in the water and wind farms and aquaculture and all the things that we actually can do, and not be scared of what happens when there's an oil crisis, when there's a war in Europe, when the global institutions decide, okay, if you don't have taxes of 15%, nobody can invest in your country. We have to provide and create a Bermuda that can withstand all of that.
All right, thank you. And Cordell, you're going to bookend us tonight. You're first, and you'll also be last.
Okay, that's just a good thing. I think overall, as I said before, the budget has allowed us, most of us, to have this collective sigh of relief, and we should take that opportunity to rebuild ourselves for what's coming. The Premier did say, as I mentioned before, that he's going to have to give us some tough medicine. I hope he gives it in the doses that are required, and that we're able to swallow that medicine without too much side effects. So we know it's coming, and we have had a stay of execution. But I actually am quite optimistic that we will get through these next couple of years, and I think we'll start to see the economy slowly grow. Whether it's going to return back to pre-2008 levels, probably not. But I think that's where the plan comes into it, and so that we know where we're going, why we're going, and what we need to get from where we're going.
All right. Thank all three of you. I personally want to thank Cheryl Packwood and Craig Simmons and Cordell Wiley for giving up their time tonight to be with us and give you their insights. So thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you. Our pleasure.
Thank you.
Take care, Don.
Okay. All right, I've been your host tonight, Don Burgess, and on behalf of Burn News, as always, have a beautiful evening.